friends, Ruth Pakaluk. She is a now associate professor of business at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. I first met her when she was a staffer at Heritage Foundation a long time ago. And we just built a friendship over time. She moved to Ave Maria, and now she's at Catholic U. She knows of what she speaks when she talks about women who put family before career. She has 8 children and 7 stepchildren. And she's been busy and remains busy. So she's going to talk to us today about the fruits of our research project, an interview based on women who have large families. And so without further ado, I would like to welcome Ruth Pakaluk.
Well, thank you. I've been told not to actually formally start, but just to say hello. And I should start by saying some things about Mark. In a sense, any big research project has multiple layers and multiple phases, and there's personal motivations and quasi-professional motivations, and a whole bunch of those are not in the presentation I'm about to share with you. But one of them is I was going to say there's a conversation that Mark and I had going years back where I'm fairly certain Mark said to me, if you don't do this for real, I'm going to do this. So he said, or if you don't write this down, I'm going to write this down. So, and that relates to a personal story, which I guess if I'm still killing time here, I'll go ahead and share with you, which is, it's in a sense, well, this was a couple of months after I'd had my 6th child, and I was on a train, a commuter train, heading, I don't know, home, I think. I don't know where I had been. I had my 6th with me. So the commuter train outside of Washington, D.C., and the baby was kind of like really small and tucked into this little thing, and just the head is showing. Do you know what I mean? One of those things. And the train is full of commuters. There's not babies on this train. So I got on this stuffed packed train, and a bunch of, people say, they're kind of shocked to see a baby on the train. And he's totally quiet, just sees head. So I kind of sat down, and this lady sitting near me said, wow, like a baby, is it your first? And I would love to know why that is the typical question when people see you with a baby. It's only, so for all you people who make comments on people's babies, don't ask people if it's their first. I don't know what they expect you to say afterwards. Yeah, it's my first. I don't know. So when you're presented with that, it turns out lots of women in my study face the same questions. When you're presented with that and it's not your first, but it's your 6th, you're kind of like, well, what do I say? Because you don't really want to have a big, long conversation about it. So, but you go back and forth. You say just no, and you don't actually say the number. But anyway, at some point I said, no, this is my 6th. At that point, it's a crowded train. People heard me, and it was like, wow, like what? 6? And there's this kind of like silence as people are kind of processing that information. And then this lady sitting next to me, she looked at me and she said, I guess your husband still wants you. And I was like, I've never heard anything like, of course, I don't think I responded. I think I just listened. I thought, well, that's not what I expected to hear. But I tucked that away, and I thought, what was that about? What was that about, and where did it come from? And that was just one of those little, things where you tuck something away. And I think something Mark has also said to me over the years is, I would say Mark's research has inspired mine in a lot of ways, is he's always said, if you have something to research that's too close to home, you got to wait a long time to do it. So that was at least 12 or 15 years ago. It took a long time to think, okay, I could sort of maybe do this and do this the right way. So a lot of unanswered questions about marriage and family. And I would say, for the sake of this audience, kind of heterodox communities, people who are really living lives that are very different from mainstream. And what can we learn from those communities? So that was something that I tucked away, and now I'm finally prepared to say something about it. although this presentation is going to focus on a different set of questions related to the same study. So, Nicholas, am I free to start? Not yet? No, not yet.
Like, very close.
What else can I
I'm
tell you
approaching
that
you
is,
right now,
that is not for the recording? Okay,
So,
yeah, so I've got lots of pockets.
excellent. Perfect. Thank you.
No worries. I could talk for an hour without getting around to what's on the slides.
What do you prefer, pocket or this? You can pick.
I put it like down here.
Yeah. So there's a clip right there too, actually, so you just clip it like that.
All right, so
And then for this, I'm just going to do.
Yeah. okay, it's
Or you like push it or something? Just flip it, it's fine.
fine.
Let me test it real quick. And then you can officially restart.
Okay,
Just say a word.
okay, testing.
Excellent. Are you saying that?
Yep,
Excellent.
great.
All right, we're good to go.
Okay.
All right.
All right. All right, well, quick thank you to the Stein Center and to the Austin Institute for inviting me to share a little bit of kind of preview of this research, which is still being pulled together. I'm going to tell you kind of what motivated the study in relation to my work as an economist in a few minutes. But what I want to do to start and to sort of kick off is kind of take you right into the heart of this research. So I'm going to share with you a story. One of the women that I talked to in this study, and then I'll kind of put this in context in a minute. And so I'm going to focus in the next 5 or 10 minutes on the story of the first of the, let's see, is this working? Oh, I have this problem at home. Yeah, the little pointer doesn't work on the screen. Okay, well, you can just imagine. So Hannah and Esther, I interviewed for this project, and I'll tell you more in a minute. I interviewed 55 women in this study. Hannah and Esther are the only two that I interviewed together. And I interviewed them together because they asked to be interviewed together. So most of what I'm going to share with you now is Hannah's story, although there are a couple of quotations from Esther. When I interviewed them in, I think it was Esther's living room, and Esther's husband was in the other room. It's very funny. These two women are best friends. Esther grew up in an Orthodox Jewish community. Hannah did not. Hannah converted from a Reformed Jewish household. So she grew up not religious at all. And by the time she was in the end of high school, in the beginning of college, Hannah had really she had lost interest in Judaism altogether, wasn't practicing anything. It was kind of searching, and I'm going to tell you about that in a minute. After Hannah converted, got married, started a family, at the time we interviewed Hannah and Esther, Hannah had 7 children, and Esther was 10 days postpartum, or I think her 10th. So this was a very memorable interview for a lot of reasons. Esther didn't stand up. She just had a baby. Hannah didn't sit down. Very different personalities. Hannah was up, kind of very, like her hands are all over the place. She had a 1-year-old with her. This is a very memorable interview. And so Hannah's story really involves a kind of conversion. And that was quite common. And I'm going to tell you more about what I was up to. But I want to get you right into the meat of this because actually there were at least out of 55 interviews, probably 10 of which I could have selected any one of them, and every major note that came up in 55 was present in that single interview. And this is one of them. I have lots more. So let's just meet Hannah. So to begin with, she's talking here, just right at the beginning, she's telling us about meeting her husband. And she meets her husband after she has become drawn to Judaism. So she talks about how right away, very important for them is they're meeting and talking. Oh, thank you so much. That's much better, right? Thank you. It's better for me, actually. I can see this much better. She says, we have both been around the block, she and her husband. We both explored, we dated in our public school secular life. She and her husband are both converters, they've converted. We are both very clear and focused that one of our main goals of getting married is to begin a family right away and want to have a large family. That was something we were attracted to with the teachers that had turned us on and inspired us as we returned to our faith. And we talked a lot about that in our first dates. Okay, so what else does she say? Then she tells us, I didn't even want to get married at one point in my life. At one point in my life, I could not see myself married. I thought I'd be like that aunt, the medicine woman person who doesn't get married. And she laughed about this. And she talks about how she wasn't even really drawn to children. And multiple times, I don't think I brought those, but she talks about how she didn't even feel that she really had the capacity. She talks later about her domestic life, and she says, you know, I'm not really good at this. I'm not good at it. My house is disorganized. It's amazing I've gotten here, she says. That's not how Esther felt, but that is definitely how Hannah felt. But this is when she, as we start to probe more deeply, you know, kind of what got you into this lifestyle? How does somebody who doesn't think they really are drawn to children becomes religious? What's going on? And she begins to talk back to the time before she got back in touch with Judaism. And she sort of talks about this time. I think she was in Hawaii at this time, but I'm trying to remember. She says, in my own quest for meaning and purpose, I was very into the concept of infinity. I did a lot of Indian meditation and things like that, kind of searching for what's the meaning of everything. And I feel like it came down to, like, the core of the answer was that children are this key to infinity. And then she talks about this link and a chain going all the way back to Abraham, Noah, and Adam. And that continuing this legacy by having children is a way to be part of this chain of infinity. And she talks, when she recalls us, that when she understood that, and she saw a kind of alternative lifestyle being presented actually by her rabbis in Israel, she looked at that and she thought, bam, like that's what I was looking for on the beaches in Hawaii when I was meditating. I was trying to get to infinity there, but it wasn't the path. This is the path. It's just, she said, that's what I want. To me, that was it. Nothing else is going to do that. Very interesting. Okay. Now, Esther, just to give you a little bit of a contrast, a very different personality. There's no big aha moment for Esther. She grew up in a fairly Orthodox home. From a young age, she knew that she would hope to grow up, find a husband, and have a large family. So she has this very quiet way. She would kind of jump in there sometimes and kind of compliment or try to expand on something that Hannah said. It was always kind of interesting. And so this is where this, I'm going to bring out, Hannah talks about this as well, but Esther probably puts it more clearly. This sense that I'm going to draw out for you a little bit later, that what these women think that they're up to is a kind of dialectic partnership with God where they're accepting these blessings. Okay. I probed and looked for a sense that people were sort of doing this for the kingdom or, you know, like doing it for God. I couldn't get it. There was a couple of borderlines, but I couldn't really get that. What I got over and over and over, almost like a ton of bricks, there was one woman, I'll tell you about her if we have time, who rejected this notion. But out of 55, 54 said, 100%, what this is about is I'm just being overwhelmed by blessings. Interesting. That doesn't mean there was no cost involved. I'll explain that. So 1 out of 55 women said, heck no, children are not a blessing. And I'll tell you about her, she's really funny. So 54 to 55. So Esther puts this very clearly. She says, this is a funny phrase. She says, God's not out to trick us and send us trouble, but children are like a great source of blessing. It might not turn out the way you expected, but children are a great source of blessing. And she kind of expanded on that. She said, my understanding is all blessings come from God. And the 3 big blessings are children, number 1, and number 2, good health, and number 3, financial sustenance, and always in that order. She says, you couldn't have too many of those things, right? You couldn't be like, well, so some other women said things like, well, why would you say no to another blessing? Why would you do that? It's a blessing. Why would you say no? Okay, very, very interesting. So she uses this language of, like you could sort of block the blessing. You could try to not accept the next blessing, but that would be, why would you, it would just clearly not be in your interest. Okay, back to Hannah. And again, you can kind of see, like for Hannah, this is a complete life shift. For Esther, it's an organic development. For Hannah, she says, relating back, thinking about that point in my life, whereas in my early 20s, I was just doing my own thing for wherever I was at that point in my life, whereas most people are at their academic years or their professional careers are doing their own thing. And then she says, you know, you would look at what I'm doing now. She thinks of herself as doing something very different from doing her own thing. She says, you would just say this doesn't fit. And then she kind of has this phrase, she says, you know, people need to hear the message that things are possible, like possibilities of expansion in your life. And of course, I'm bringing you one person's story. Other people use the language of capacity, that when they began to have children, they didn't think they had the capacity to have 7, for sure. She doesn't think so. But she says, well, then what happens is there's this thing. In fact, I don't think I brought this quote for you, but Hannah says it to us at some point early on. She says, she sort of stopped. She's talking about the first couple of kids she has. She says, there's something really special I want to share with you. And I'm kind of like waiting. And she says, you know, when I had one, I didn't think I could love anything as much as my first child. And I didn't see how it was going to work to have a second child. It felt like it would be it. And then she says, but the special thing I want to share with you is your heart grows. She says, you change, you love more. And she says, I didn't understand that. And then, but many people express this. Your capacity grows. I like Hannah's expression, possibilities of expansion. You're not going to be the same person. You're going to be a different person. But that's a key, this idea that you're going to become a different person. That's a key to something that I'm going to try to pull out as a kind of part of the sort of policy implications for this. And I'm going to get you there. So Hannah says towards the end, she says, I have no regrets, not a one. I mean, this is way harder now than it was then. When was it then? When I was doing my own thing. This is way harder now, she says. But I have inner peace in my life that I didn't have then. I was searching then, I'm not searching now. Okay. Then at the very end of this interview, there was a very funny back and forth between these two, and I tried to give you a sort of sense of what it was like to hear these two women talk about largely the same kind of thing, but they had a very different approach. So Hannah, when she's saying she has no regrets, she says, there's not the most ideal career that I wish that I had, could compare these, my children, are so obviously the most unbelievable accomplishments that we could ever hope to produce in this world. Okay, very funny turn of phrase. Esther immediately jumps in. She says, do I feel like my children are my accomplishments? She says, no, I really feel like they are who they are. Okay, so there's a kind of back and forth that's very funny. And then Hannah wants to correct herself. She wants to revise what she said when she hears this. So Hannah jumps back in and says, okay, I feel accomplished that I got to this point where I had children. Remember at the beginning, she never wanted to be married. She didn't want to have kids. And she didn't think she was able to have more than one. I mean, she just thought that was going to be too much stress for her. And she says, I don't feel they are my accomplishments, but I feel accomplished that I got to this point in my life. Okay, so this was a funny back and forth that we watched, and it's great. This is a funny piece that I asked almost all of my subjects at some point, is there anything else that I haven't, that you want to share with us that I haven't, anything you want to get on the record? And Esther's getting on the record. She says, yes, I would like to get one thing on the record. She says, when we filled up a minivan, it was hard for me to think about. I actually recall thinking when we had less than 5, what are we going to do when we don't all fit in a minivan? She says, it seemed like a barrier, but life continues when you don't fit into a minivan. You just don't go anywhere all together at once or whatever. There's all these funny little things. I want to tell you that my research interest in this project had absolutely nothing to do with people's logistics or how they handle their lives or how they balance work and family. I can't tell you much about that. But occasionally there are these little snippets that came out, and some of them are memorable, and so I included them. Okay, but I need to get around to one of the most interesting things that Hannah said before I give you the larger context for this study. So the title of this particular presentation, not planned by us, is very important, and it's something that was pulled out for many of these interviews. And so I'm going to give you sort of the sneak peek here at the end of this little commentary. So how does this work out for people? Someone like Hannah who thinks, like, I could never have 7 kids, like that's just like a completely crazy thought, but then she ends up with 7 children. How does this work out? So I couldn't decide which of these quotes I wanted to give you. This is the order in which we heard them. But this is a really important sort of pause. You need to hear how this works because we heard this over and over and it's quite interesting. But I'm gonna change my mind. This morning I thought, no, I'll do quote 11 first, but you're gonna hear this first. So Hannah says, I would say I had that moment where I would say, I'm done. I personally know my limits and have pushed my limits like big time. I'm at a point, I'm at a time where I don't feel like I can push my limits anymore. So I have that personal statement that I contend with. I'm done. I don't know, those of you who might have children out there, I mean, you know that this is a very normal, I'm done. People ask me this all the time, are you done? Like, obviously I'm done. Right? But women ask each other this all the time, when are you done? Do you know when you're done? It's a thing. I'm done. So Hannah's saying, she's saying, my personal statement that I contend with, I'm done. She says, but do we ever really know what's going to happen? I also hold that. Am I really in charge? No, I'm not in charge, she said. This is all a direct quote. On a personal level, I'm like, I can't handle anymore, like honestly. And you have to picture, she is standing there holding her 1-year-old and sort of like her hand is out. And then she says, does God have something else in store for me? I hope not. But I also know that I'm not the planner of all plans. It's very interesting. So the reason you need to see the other quotation that comes before this, what she said first, is because you need to understand how for women who have, I'm going to use the language later, they've entrusted the design and size of their family to God's providence, the use of the language of providence a lot. For this group of people, you need to kind of understand how it works out. They don't see themselves as lacking agency. So when I move into sort of some of the language the economists use when we look at these questions, this is not a story about lacking agency, somebody who's just going to, randomly show up pregnant next month and go, oh, well, God intended for me to get pregnant again. It's not how it works. And we heard a version of what I'm going to show you in a minute over and over and over. Okay, so it's a little bit long, but I've kind of highlighted the important things. She says, there's this moment that happens after every kid where you feel, I'm so not ready yet. I'm not ready for another child. I'm not ready. And then she says there's a shift. And I think it happens differently. I mean, so she talks about after each child. I mean, how did she get from 1 to 7? She says, this is how it worked, right? And we talked to women of many different religious creeds. They all had radically different views and practices regarding birth control. So when you read something like this, they're all doing something different. But most of the women we talked to used some type of family planning in between their children. Okay. But what was different about them is they didn't do this I'm done thing and burn the bridges, right? So they were willing to be ready again, but they knew they weren't ready for a while. Okay, so what did that look like? Okay, then there's a shift, and she says, like, the question you ask yourself in general, I want to have more. So I would pray to have the ability to be the vessel to have more. I want to want more. So she recognizes that you need to want the next one because God respects your freedom. This is their view. God respects your agency and your freedom. You have to say yes. You have to be ready. So I would pray to have that ability. I would pray to want more. Because sometimes I'm like, I don't want, but I want to want, Right? You could substitute in here many other things we know about in human life, right? You want to be the person who wants to be on a diet. You want to be the person who wants to be a runner. I mean, anything that you have as a goal in your life. This is very normal behavior. This fits all of these typical descriptions of people who are kind of rationally working out the differences between, in a sense, the passions and their rational goals. And she says, well, there would be this shift, and I'll go through this mentally difficult space, and then I would feel blah, and she says, and then I would do something to get back in shape, exercise or something, therapy, little things, and she said, and then there would be this moment where I would think, oh, I can handle this again. I could do one more. And then she says, it wasn't even me saying it, maybe it was God saying it, but I'm ready for this. So it's the move from I'm not ready to I'm ready. So that was quite interesting. So that's how this works. And then you go back and read this again. Read code 12 again. Am I really in charge? No, I'm not in charge. So she's not saying, like, bam, like she's gonna get hit with a child when she doesn't feel like she's ready. She's not saying we can't practice family planning. I just have to take all the kids that possibly, like, we could physically conceive. She's saying, well, there's gonna be this back and forth, and at some point I have felt ready. But it was pretty clear when we talked to her at child number 7, and I have not talked to her since then, and this was a few years ago. She was not that optimistic that she would feel ready again. She thought she was probably done. She hoped she was done, right? And she was also 40, so, statistically, she probably was close to being done, if not done. Okay, and so let me tell you about this study. So where did this come from? Very briefly, I don't need to tell you about the total fertility rates in this country. The birth dearth was published in 1989. And in 1989, when Ben Wattenberg was telling everybody, we should be very concerned about this. And, I was thinking about it historically. It's just not that long after the population bomb in time, right? But when Ben Wattenberg is writing about this in 1989, the total fertility rate in the United States is actually still above replacement. It's still 2.08. Right now, you probably know this. You've read a little bit about it, probably because COVID had a pretty interesting impact on birth rates. And we're not done assessing the impact of COVID on birth rates. But in any case, it's just basically generally bad news. I mean, why is it bad news? It's bad news mainly just because social programs don't work out very well if you have below replacement fertility. So if you're committed to social programs, a certain shape of public provision, you can't do that with a 1.64 birth rate. So that's why it's bad news. There's also bad news maybe related to intended fertility. There's some evidence that across the West, women are getting fewer children than they wanted to have. This is called a fertility gap. So I don't need to show you a lot of this. I'm going to move through this very quickly. But this is like the World Economic Forum who spent a lot of time telling us that we need to get birth rates in order. But now they're even the World Economic Forum is concerned about declining birth rates. Italy's like at 1.3, 1.25. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy. These are like crazy numbers. Okay. And in the US, we used to think that we were very immune from these problems. When I was growing up, the constant sort of explanation was we didn't really have to worry about so much immigration. We were going to get higher birth rates from immigration. And this is essentially no longer true. And it's a combination of things. We've had less immigration in the last decade, but also what's also true is that immigrants, when they come, they converge to native birth rates very quickly. And convergence of low birth rates is kind of the major global story of birth rates. It's very difficult to put your finger on the globe anywhere on any continent where there's a total fertility rate above 4. There's like 2 places in the world. And even the places that in your mind, don't say them out loud, that you think, oh, they're having a million kids, like whatever you think, they're not. There's like, most places are, the high fertility parts of the world are at maybe three children per woman, and converging quickly to United States rates. A great factoid is that it took Mexico 30 years to make the demographic transition that the United States had over 200 years. So in the time of my lifetime, total fertility rates in Mexico went from where they were in the US in 1800 all the way to sort of the present. So this is basically the story. So essentially, in part because I have a lot of kids, in part because I know people who have a lot of kids, there was a moment in time where I thought, well, wait a second, actually, maybe in the manner of the discovery of the smallpox vaccine, maybe people who are not experiencing plummeting birth rates could tell us something about plummeting birth rates. Great. In other words, who's immune? Who is not experiencing these sorts of very, very sharp declines in fertility? So you kind of ask that question. So this is a page from Edward Jenner's great treatise on the discovery of the smallpox vaccine. Okay, so this was basically the research question: who's immune? Why are they immune? What are their motives? What do they think it means? What makes them different? And what are some of the policy implications? So in the time that is remaining, I will give you a brief tour through that, just a brief tour, some of the takeaways. Okay, so you need to see this. So one of the things, so let me go back for a minute. As I started to write about this, I've discovered it's hard to write about it. Why is it hard to write about it? Because it doesn't have a name, right? So there's no name for this group of people. So I have to make up stuff. And so for the moment, it sounds a little funny, but I'm working on that. So I have come to say that the people I'm interested in, I've given you just a standard distribution, so distribution of women by the number of children that are ever born. So what you're looking at here is the year of my birth, 1976. This is women whose, essentially whose fertility was completed in 1976. Okay, so these people were born a lot earlier. So this is what the distribution looks like. So essentially, if you cut the data in 1976, this is Census Bureau data, 10% of women had one child, 22% of women had two children in the 40 to 45 bucket, 23% had three, a whopping 16% had four, 14% have 5 or 6, or 5 or 6, that should be 5 or 6. And then 6% have 7 or more children. Now again, remember, these are women who are completing their fertility in the 1970s. They were born in the 1930s. Okay, so this is a very different time. Okay, so I'm marking out for you this space, the women who have 5 or 6, 7, as well. I can't trace this with my pointer, but think of this as it's a distribution. So think of that right-hand side is the upper tail of the distribution. So the first point is that the upper tail still exists. So this was 1976. Here's a pretty hefty, it's a 20%, this upper tail. Now, why did I cut it there? That's arbitrary. We cut it in lots of places. Right. But basically, this is what it looks like. If we look at it today, or this is the latest date for which I can get this data from the CPS. This is, it's a great change, right? It's really fun to look at. Okay, big, catastrophically big change. Okay, so if we're looking at the same buckets, the 5 and 6 and 7 plus, it's only 5%. Okay, so what happened? Where did we? So we lost people from the upper tail. They shifted down, right? So obviously, lots of people shifted down into the 2 children bucket, but we have an extra 5% in the no children. We have an extra almost double in the 1 child bucket. So yeah, just a lot of shifting downwards and more bunching around that 1 and 2. That's what we would totally expect given what happened with the fertility rates. So, but here's my point. It's not as if that upper tail doesn't exist anymore. So those are like sizable numbers of people. You just haven't met them very much. Or maybe you met them, maybe some of you have. You've met me now, but I was not gonna out myself, but Mark has outed me. So there's still a number of these people, and kind of like, who are they and what are they doing? So like, I knew who I was, but I didn't know who the other people were. So I thought it'd be good to find out like what they were like and see if it could be useful to talk with them. So this is the idea. So I'm calling them women with upper tail birth rates, essentially. These are upper tail birth rates. Okay, so this is a thing that has always, I'm a huge fan of just the history of statistics. It's something I think about a lot. And I stumbled up on this great quote by Friedrich Hayek the other day, which I think is wonderful. Hayek says, one of the reasons why economists are increasingly apt to forget about the constant small changes which make up the whole economic picture. We can substitute demographic picture there, same, the point is still the same, is probably their growing preoccupation with statistical aggregates, which show a very much greater stability than the movements of the detail. So when I just told you, oh, like here's what's happened with the total fertility rates, right? Okay, well, not everybody is at a 1.64, right? Like that's an average. that's a statistical aggregate. So the point in the first place is, hey, actually, there's still some people in these tales. There's a lot of variation that's disguised by the aggregate. Let's go find out what's going on. All right, so that was kind of the motivation. So these are the places I went. I went around and, we could talk later if you're interested, how did I find people? I went out and looked for people who were in that upper tail, had 5 or more, 5, 6, 7 or more. I think the largest number of children, if anybody that I talked to, was 15. Just one mother, 15 children, one set of twins. Obviously, the smallest number was 5. That was the cutoff to begin the study. So those are the cities and regions that I went to. I talked to 55 people. These were 2 to 3 hour long, open-ended interviews. What else should I tell you? Yeah, so this is what I did. Okay. The diversity of religion, I probably had, ultimately people belonging to, I would say most of the major sort of mainstream Christian churches, lots of members of the LDS Church, Reform, Hasidic, and Orthodox Jews, Catholics, Baptists, evangelicals, gamut. We looked for Muslim women. We kind of had a hiccup with our contact who's going to help us out with that. So that is envisioned for the future, but we didn't get any Muslim women in this sample.
Were they all of some religion?
That's an interesting question. We, in addition to looking for Muslims, and we didn't get anybody because our contact failed, we looked really hard for people who had no religion. We went so far as to contact the head of the United States Atheist Association. We said, do you have anybody in your membership who has a large family? We tried very hard. And the guy was great. He wrote back to us. He was actually very, very helpful. And he said, I've looked all through our databases, and he said, I can't find anybody that has 5 or more children. And then he says, and then he attached a couple of scholarly articles and said, but I think I know why, he said to us. It turns out that having a lot of kids is highly correlated with being religious. I said, I know, that's why we contacted you. We really wanted to make sure we tried very hard. So that was news to him. He did not know that. So that was pretty fun. I told you about, there was one woman in our sample. She would have put herself somewhere in the borderline between being a fairly conservative Reform Jew, maybe sort of borderline into, she considered herself a lot more Jewish than your standard Reform Jew, but she wasn't Orthodox at all. She was the least religious person out of 55 in my whole sample. She's the one who said, kind of, heck no, children are not blessings. That was the least religious person we talked to. So yeah, basically everybody was religious, which we knew this, but this is in the data. However, very importantly, basically everybody who has 5 or more children, upper tail birth rates, basically everybody is religious. Right? But basically not everybody who's religious has 5 or more children. Okay, so you have to keep that in mind, right? So it's not clear to me, although I'm kind of still trying to work out how I want to think about this. It's not clear to me that it's fair to say religion on its own is causal. Right? It's certainly highly correlated, but is it causal, or is there some other factor? What about these particular religious people? So I am working to try to formulate what I think that is. And that's where I'm going to go a little bit before we wrap up. I'm going to tell you, I think this is a type of religious orthodoxy. And what's the nature of that religious orthodoxy? And in fact, it's quite difficult to define religious orthodoxy when we think about sort of the sociology of religion. How do you define orthodoxy, right? And so, if you talk to people on the street, you say tell me about your church, or what are people like? Ask people to describe what kinds of experiences they have. And there always comes to this point where they say, well, the Orthodox people are they just really believe, right? What does that even mean? That's not operational, right? Okay, so one of the things I think that will come out of this study is a better picture of what it means to be. I'm avoiding the term fundamentalist. I think that has a lot of other, Orthodoxy also has other sorts of characteristics, but that's part of the issue here, right? It seems that this country is highly religious, tons and tons of people still identify with being religious, but they don't all like go run out and have 7 children. So
The question is, are
Yeah.
you even forced or were the parents forced? Did you get into that?
I do, I have all of that. Yeah, I would say it's highly varied. Like, meaning this is not a group of people who all came from intact homes. It's not a group of people who all came from divorced homes. It's highly varied. It was also not a group of people who all came from large families. Highly varied. There are people who said, I grew up with no siblings. I was an only child, and I thought that was a terribly lonely way to grow up.
But they're all married.
They're
All
very-
of them are married.
Oh, in my sample, they're all married. Yeah, and that was more for research purposes than anything else.
So,
Yeah, it turns out that very few people who are not married have 5 children.
well,
It turns out it's not unheard of, but it's not. So I was trying to remove from my sample things that could confound the object of study here. Okay, so this is what I have, and so kind of to sort of pull things together for you. Let's see. So yeah, so what are the findings? And so I'm not gonna walk through all the other stories that I have because it would take us all afternoon. The popular narrative, this gets back to this kind of confusion of correlation with causation. There are essentially 2 explanations out there. Why are there people still in the upper tail, right? I mean, this is the research question. Why do those people exist? You know, the sort of standard one that you hear all the time is, well, like they just don't have as much education. This is a huge correlation causation problem, right? So we do know for sure, if you want to look globally in the country, there's a very high correlation between educational level and how many children. But this is clearly not causal. Why is it clearly not causal? Well, because the mediating factor is just opportunity cost in the labor market. This is one of the things I was after, actually, because everybody in my study has a college degree. So this is kind of one of the things I was after. I dug into and asked a lot of questions about that.
But that wasn't, you didn't screen for that at the time.
Oh, I know, I did screen for that.
But
Yeah.
you wanted them to
Yeah.
have that.
I wanted them to have a college degree for a lot of reasons. One, in part, because I wanted to find out what the variation looks like within that sample. Another reason for this, in this particular study, back to that story I told at the beginning, I was also interested in things like marriage quality. But if you want to look at marriage quality in a small qualitative sample, you kind of have to try to abstract from things like financial distress. So you want a group of people that you think is largely going to be free from the kinds of stresses that not being employed might have. So there were a couple of reasons to exclude people who didn't have college degrees. But I would say, so everybody had a college degree in my sample. I don't know if I have the percent, I mean, at least 40% had some kind of graduate degree as well. I mean, doctors, lawyers, PhDs, college professors, right? People on food stamps. And I had people living in super zips. I mean, it was like very highly varied. So, in a sense, a small, like, what do you do with a small 55-person sample? I mean, you don't extrapolate to the whole population, right? It's not representative. But this study, because it's sort of a first look at these people, in a sense, is a kind of it's kind of proof of existence. It's sort of like they exist. They're not all undereducated. There's a bit of that sort of the job of just describing who's there. You would have to go out and design a good survey, and then you could get kind of a sense of like, well, what percentage of all the women in the upper tail have a college degree? We could do that. But of course, the first step is this, and then you build your nice survey later. But we don't even know what to put in the survey, so this is why you want to start here. So what did we find talking with these people? So, I mean, of course, I'm coming at this, I'm an economist, and there's a long tradition of thinking about kind of human motivation. We do things differently, right? We tend to think, well, there's these kind of like simple or simplistic, you could say, question. Well, it turns out that everybody in our study talked about trade-offs and kind of weighing costs and benefits, right? So I guess I would say there's actually a couple of really interesting research programs right now among some heterodox economists who are kind of interested in taking this paradigm of the rational choice framework and looking at populations that we tend as, you know, members of like normal society, we tend to think these sorts of populations are not necessarily behaving rationally. So one of the most interesting research programs right now has to do with prison gangs and understanding prison gangs as being a completely normal outcome given the kinds of trade-offs that prisoners face. I don't want to present Skarbek's research for you, but that's a really interesting thing. And so at some point I scratched my head and I thought, well, what's going on with these other sort of popular narratives is that people look at this thing, if they've ever heard of upper tail birth rates, it was like the Duggars on TV, or it was Sister Wives, or it was something that was completely appalling, or voyeuristic, or it was described in a weird way. And so it's just a black box. They don't know what's going on. And so I guess I thought at some point it could be kind of useful to just point out that what I heard sitting there listening was just a standard description of like, these are the costs and these are the benefits. What made these people different from their peers is that the structure of their costs and benefits are different. So this is really a subjective value story, which is very familiar for us as economists. These are people who just have a different set of benefits in the benefit column. And one of the reasons to emphasize this is because I did not get, remember I said there was a range from 15, well, okay, down to 5. I did not get stories of people who are saying, yeah, actually, I'm about to die because I keep having kids contrary to my health. I did not get stories of like, I would never know when to, it was kind of like each of them had a story about how they got to where they were, because of course I interviewed them at a moment in time. And the number that they had at that moment, they had a story about how it reflected their own trade-offs. The women who were up in the 10 plus children, they weren't pursuing a career. But the women who were in the sub 10s, lots of them had careers. I had a full-time breadwinner who was the mom. They had 5 kids. Her husband was a stay-at-home dad. She was a pediatrician. So my point is, you found like a pretty normal, as economists think about it, articulation of these are our values, like given our values, this is how we size it up, which is actually a finding. We found that, okay, so this is the structure of values, religious orthodoxy. I'm putting it in scare quotes because I'm working on kind of coming up with the formulation. I'm going to suggest that a certain kind of attitude towards childbearing is part of how we should think about religious orthodoxy. Religious orthodoxy provides kind of faith that children or childbearing has transcendent eternal value, a blessing from God. And what this ends up looking like is that career plans are not neglected, they're not ditched. Again, they really vary. We had another doctor, a woman who was an MD, finished her residency, and she discovered, unlike the one I just described to you, she hated practicing medicine. So that was her value. She just got to the end of her residency and said, I hate this. I never want to go back. Her husband is a hospitalist and a really interesting guy. So we had the pediatrician who's full-time practicing and supporting her family, and the doctor who just ditched medicine after she had her first kid. But basically they all had the same view that whatever their attitude was towards whether they liked or didn't like their career, that career was adjusted to fit into an overall narrative of family and childbearing versus or contrasted with family and childbearing adjusted like in terms of time or phase of life in order to fit a narrative of career and professional identity. So that was just how they weighed the values. Another way to put this, I've used this language of not planned by us. They were generally, there are a couple of exceptions to this, they were people who generally entrusted the size of their family to God's design and providence. They were generally people who had adopted motherhood as a way of life and not as a phase of life. It's also very common to hear women of my age talk about when my kids were little, right? Or when, until my youngest is in school, it's a phase. Well, the women we talk to, like they're in the phase of your kids being little for 20 or 30 years. Like that's very unusual, right? That's very, so it couldn't be like this thing that you get it done and then it's over with, right? There are various expressions of this. I'm going to come around to kind of like the last thing in a minute. Another thing we heard really jumped off the page and really, I think, says something about kind of the policy implication, that the biggest costs that people talked about, so remember I said they're doing this cost benefit thing. What are the costs? What are the things they said were difficult or hard? They weren't primarily financial. The biggest costs were personal sacrifices. Like, remember that thing where they're doing little kids for 20 years and not for 5? Well, imagine like not sleeping through the night for 20 years. That's a really hard thing to do. That's something you like, it's like you scramble up a mountain and you get to the top, you're like, oh, okay, I'm done. They scramble up the mountain and they go, okay, let's do it again. Like, let's do it again. And they're all ready to tell you, yeah, this is really, really hard. This is like tear producing hard. So they just tell you this, it's not like, not that. So the point here is that the sum of the personal costs, what we heard is that they're deep and life altering. So many women in the study compared having a child to a type of death, like a kind of mini type of death. It's like some of them, because they are religious, use the language of the cross, they were Christian. Okay, so this led us to think, okay, well, if you really want to increase birth rates, and you go back to those slides where you're looking at the 1.6s, you have to get something on the scale that is as big and deep and life-altering as the personal sacrifices involved. And this is kind of how I'm thinking about it, right? Those personal sacrifices are really big, and if on the benefit side of the scale is a set of things like personal desires, like your desires for kids. A lot of people talk about personal growth as the kind of thing that came from having children. You'll find this universally if you talk to people, whether they have 5 or 2. They'll talk about the way in which they become different, better through having children. But ultimately, if you want that to keep going, you need to get something on that scale that's heavier. It's gotta be heavier. This is what we heard. All right, so that's kind of how I'm like visualizing this. Going back to this, the one thing that came out of this data, so I'll say 54 out of 55 subjects, was that like God was the thing on that other side of the scale. And not God per se, but kind of like what's wrapped up with this like religious orthodoxy. Really believing, okay, I don't like to use that language, it's not very operational, but believing that this thing subjectively perceived by the subject has so much value, there's almost nothing else you wouldn't put in the scale against it, right? That's what we heard. So I'm going back here. The single exception in my data, I told you there was an exception. She's not very religious. Why did that one lady who said, heck no, kids are not blessings, why did she have 5 children? She had 5 children because her husband wanted 9. And he was not a religious guy. Draw your own conclusions. It was the closest thing we heard out of 55 interviews to something like, my husband just wants like a lot of children. Like something that's very sort of archaic in a certain sense. She frequently, I'll say this, she and her husband, enormously successful, live in a super zip. She's not like an oppressed wife. She and her husband both have PhDs. I've got lots of great quotations from her, but she multiple times said, it's really difficult to describe why my husband wants 9 without making him sound like a really bad guy. He thinks he's like got great genes and just wants to have a lot of kids because genes are awesome. And, I mean, I'm being subtle. There were some words there that were colorful. For the sake of the camera, I'm not gonna read them to you straight up. But why did she do it? So we kept asking her, well, why are you having 5 kids? She didn't want 5 kids. She said, I would have stopped at 2. So why are you doing this? Why do you have 5 kids? She says, well, honestly, I love him a lot. And it's the only thing I can give him. So it's interesting because to us, like, okay, we learned something about religious orthodoxy. But I guess I would want to say you could kind of, if you're willing to expand that notion of sort of like love for God to something like, what's the kind of thing that gets you to do this thing, which is so really difficult that it's a little bit like dying. Well, it has to be something transcendental. So 54 of them are doing it because of how they see the world, love for God. and one is doing it love for her husband. It's just that it's super uncommon to find a guy these days who wants to have 9 kids. That's not common. It certainly wasn't common in our sample. Okay, so that kind of leads me to my last couple slides here, which are just maybe some like humble policy implication suggestions, and the kinds of things I'm working on now. So we know that policy operates on the margin, right? So when you, as a policymaker, you want to design a policy, the only place you can operate is the margin. You hope to nudge people in one direction or the other. One thing we heard over and over and over is that these trade-offs, these costs and benefits are not stable. They're not stable. So certainly on the value side, there's certain things that are stable. On the cost side, there's certain things that are stable. But when thinking about the margin, moving from one child to the next, we heard lots of interesting things, and I've just quoted one of them for you up there, but I could pull a whole bunch together. This is Leah, who has 5 kids, she's 40. She said, it's such a shame to only have 1 or 2 kids because you put in so much time, so much effort, blood and sweat and tears to learn how to be a good parent. And by the time you get to kid 3, 4, and 5, you're a different person. You're good at this now. So lots of them described kind of like anguished decisions when they were going from 1 to 2, from 2 to 3. But a lot of them talked about, once we had 6, like 7 really just didn't make any difference. It's kind of true, right? If you think about it, like what about your life is going to have to change? If you have 6, you're already out of a minivan, you're already buying a million groceries, like very little changes. So this is so they talked a lot about the marginal costs becoming smaller. And again, go back to this idea that the biggest costs they talked about were what? The biggest costs were these personal costs. So those personal costs, the personal marginal costs, the financial costs also become smaller. Lots of them were kind of like, people don't realize you don't have to buy all this stuff every time. You buy it once and you just have it, The financial costs diminish, but the personal costs diminished even more with greater numbers of children, because the lifestyle part, that's the big piece. The big piece is like, I was just doing my own thing and now I've got this human being that's attached to me, right? That's a life-altering change. I used to sleep through the night. Now I'm not going to sleep through the night. That's a life-altering change. How do you policy-wise nudge somebody across that line? That's really hard. Those of you in the room that are parents, you know that first child is like huge, and it's a huge change. Second child, still a huge change. The third child, quite interesting. A lot of the women in our sample said 3 was the hardest number of kids to have. I mean, these are people who've had enough kids to look back and tell you there's like a number that was like peak hard and then it got easier. All right, so Leah's idea was, well, like it's really a shame if you stop before you kind of realize that there's a place where it just gets easier. Whatever, we had a lot of that sort of thing. So from the policy perspective, not all of the margins are the same. So that ought to be important for us in terms of policy. And this is a standard policy result, right? Which is that subjective and highly diverse costs and benefits exist. And they drive behavior. So I discovered that the Stein Center is doing a lot of work on COVID mitigation policies and the effects of some of these things. And one of the big and interesting takeaways of that kind of research is that actually people's costs and benefits, their risks and rewards to various kinds of policies, they're all quite different. So the margins are different. The expected treatment cost of nudging people from 2 to 3 kids, if you could do it at all, very, very different from nudging people. So who's it easier to nudge? You were like looking at society, you're thinking like, who could you nudge to have another kid? Well, it would be the people who are already in the upper tail. Those are the easy people to nudge. You could probably nudge them pretty easily. But my point number 2, 75% or more, depending on whether you use the current cut or you use projected cuts, 85% of women are in the first couple of buckets there. Those are the hard people to nudge. It's going to be really, really expensive if you could even do it at all to nudge those people. And the third sort of policy suggestion is that we should consider the fact that, we think about policy typically in probably 2 narrow buckets. So if some kind of religious orthodoxy becomes a very, very powerful explanatory variable for upper tail birth rates, or even just for above replacement fertility increasingly, well then maybe religion policy is also part of family policy. So how do we treat how do we handle religious communities? Where do these sorts of strong Orthodox type communities come from? Like, where do they, what threatens their existence? What fosters their existence? Where does it come from? Why does it change over time? So that would be sort of that last point, is that, and I'm also somebody who studies a lot of school policy, and I think school policy has a lot to do with family policy as well. So that's this other implication, is that probably we should not consider these buckets all very different from a policy perspective. And so that is all I have for you for now. And I can take some questions or
when you talk about the marginal sort of difficulty of going from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3, I think that there's a concrete ceiling with regard to societal peer pressure at 3. I think at least, or maybe in different parts of the country, there's a different level. But I think, for example, where I am in Houston, it's 3, and it's not that difficult to get to 3, but then you find almost nobody who goes over 3, and I think it's the big thing is the peer pressure of not, of opening yourself up to comments from people, and they don't want that.
So now I could be silly to tell you that 3 is the most number of people you can fit in a nice car. I literally heard this in college. 3 was the desired number of children, because after that you had to have a minivan. I mean, that's a terrible thing to do. But moving past being silly, and actually there's a couple of studies on that related to car seats and how you can fit car seats in car. Anyway, so these things matter. But we did hear from lots of the women in our study that where you live and the community that you live in and what kind of peer pressure there is mattered a great deal. And what did we typically hear? Because we were interested in finding out, how did you become the kind of person who would consider even having a 4th or a 5th or a 6th, right? How did you get to be that person? And a couple of our subjects, we discovered, they were maybe on the fence after the 3rd, and they moved to a place where, at their church, there were lots of people who had 5 or 6 kids, and they've never heard of that before. And they looked around and they thought, gee, hey, honey, we could do this. Like, look at this, it's not that crazy. So I think you're quite right. There are lots of regional variation of different church communities. So communities matter a lot. Sir.
So did you do a report study of like if the subjects or how many might have had a role in deciding when? In other words, if either pacing or not having a say in when or how often or things like that?
Just the first part of your question, whether the subjects themselves, because we interviewed the women, or were you referring to their partners?
Well, that would be an offshoot of that.
Okay.
That was sort of also about impregnating or the impregnated.
Yeah. So I want to say at the outset, this was never designed as a study about birth control, but it came up a little bit. What we found was that I left you with one more quote from a different person who talked about this problem of using the language of planned. So lots of them had this problem. They said, we don't fit this planned or unplanned category, right? So does that mean then that there's like no agency or no decision making? I mean, and so we heard lots of different versions of that, but I would say I can only think of 2 out of 55 who said that they had become convicted at the beginning of their marriage that, so in Kim's language, it was, we're just going to be open to it, whatever, all the time. So there was no decision. It would just be the kid was born, and whenever the next time you managed to conceive, that's when you had the next child. But that was 2 out of 55. 53 women out of 55 said it's very intentional, meaning we are using some form of family planning until we feel ready, and we as I. So there was none of our subjects except the one whose husband wanted 9, who said, my husband's really the guy pushing this decision. It was always, I've got lots of different versions of this. My husband says whatever you want. So if you want 7, that's fine with me. Now that's quite interesting. That's different from most American men already. That's different, tells you something about these guys. But also they were saying, it's largely like when I'm ready. And there's my mental health, there's my physical health, there's what our family is up to, there's my career. In a lot of cases, there were career considerations. So nothing I saw looked like totally unplanned. I guess I don't, if that's the essence of your question.
Well, I'm just asking
yeah.
what you're finding.
Yeah. That's what I would say. But yeah, just all manner of approaches to family planning, very different. I mean, the Hasidic Jews have a completely different way of approaching this to the Catholics, to the Mormons, to everybody. It was very different. But we weren't digging into their, I mean, we heard the stories, but
Those were incidental parts.
they were incidental in the sense that this is not a study about family planning, because this, one of the things that, and I think this matches most of what we know about childbearing among everybody out there. Like we know this about single moms, right? Is that single parenthood in this country is not a story about not having access to birth control or not knowing how to use birth control. It's actually completely a story of like interesting things related to meaning and purpose and what people are choosing. So I think that in that sense it fits with that finding. Yes.
So going to like a policy perspective, I know just studying like total fertility rates, I've done a little bit of study on some of that stuff. The only 2 countries I can think of in the 21st century, or like I guess sort of like late 20th century as well, would have gone from below total fertility rate, like below like 2 or whatever, to above, have been Georgia, like the country of Georgia,
yes,
and Iran. In both of those, I know, for instance, I think it was about a decade ago, patriarch Ilya,
that's right.
who is like, Georgia's a very Orthodox country. He's like a patriarch. He's like one of those highly respected figures in all of Georgia. 90+% of people like love in Georgia. He says something to the effect of like, as I'm saying this, if you have, your 4th or 3rd or more child afterwards, all personally got pictures.
Yes.
And that's a huge thing. And within the past 10 years, they've gone from like, I think like 1.8, 1.9, it's like 2.1, 2.2 in the span of like a decade. And then the other instance is Iran, which has also gone, from like 1.8 to now like 2.1 or something like that. So, and I know there's a bunch of countries in Europe, like Hungary and France, which try to do a more like incentive-based thing.
Correct.
So I was just saying, how do you think that how can we use examples of Georgia and Iran for like maybe like modern day policy making?
Yeah, that is exactly what I meant on that last slide. Was sort of like, how do you get more like patriarchs like the one in Georgia? I mean, first of all, I think we have to kind of make sure it's widely known that appeals to religious, I guess I'd say to sort of religious ideals seem to have a greater effect on people's willingness to have children than the financial incentives. I mean, obviously, you look at this, I mean, there's like books and books and books. It's really tough to make a case you could get the job done with financial incentives. I think Hungary is a really weird case, and the jury is definitely not out on whether that has worked or will work. I'm highly doubtful it will work.
But my understanding of all of the problem with European things, as you said, it's not that people are, it's more so the problem is people having 0 children and people with large families having less children. It's that 0 category. And then like you said, it's hard to get people to go to 0.
It's hard to get people to cross that line. That's exactly right. So, but your question is exactly kind of the question I'm kind of asking. It's like religion policy is family policy. So, are there ways in which, I mean, like this case of Yeshiva University in New York, I mean, are there ways in which we are, maybe not appreciating the unintended consequences of kind of really marginalizing and making it difficult for sort of Orthodox communities to live their Orthodox lives? Like, are there ways we're not thinking about that as potentially connected to other things we care about? But I don't really know the answer, but I do know that almost nobody's aware that religion has such a, religious orthodoxy, I'll say, has such a more powerful effect on birth rates than, certainly not suggesting that the United States government adopts any sort of like pro-natalist position. I don't really agree with that, so. Yes.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I appreciate how you talked about transcendental values, sort of balancing out the scales. You know more about this than I do, but I don't know if religious orthodoxy is the right category to be emphasizing here, and it feels sort of Catholic-centric to me. I'm a Protestant. For us Protestants, orthodoxy is all over the place. So if you're Baptist, you're going to be non-Orthodox to a Catholic or a Greek Orthodox person. If you're Christian, you're non-Orthodox to a Jewish person. And you've talked about talking with sociologists of religion. I'm just wondering if it would help to talk with people in the humanities, like theologians or religious studies scholars, who might have more categories. To zero in on whatever this phenomenon is, whether it's fervor or belief or practice. But religious orthodoxy feels a little too big to me right now and a little too nebulous, but that's just my initial reaction.
I think that's totally fair. I'm really struggling with it, which is why I verbalized it and I put it in scare quotes. I don't know the answer to this, but when I started to dig into it, I discovered that almost no one has a way to describe what it is. I mean, so here's an interesting, like you go to, like, let's forget about the Catholics for a second and the Jews. You go to like Provo or Salt Lake City and you talk to a bunch of members of the LDS church who have 7 kids, for instance. And they'll tell you, number one, I feel like a weird outlier in my church. And they are, actually. Mormon birth rates have collapsed just like everybody else's. They don't look different. The average is maybe a slight difference, but I mean, basically they don't look. And so then you say, well, why are you different? And they all that it comes down to is this other thing, this other category. They say, well, this is how I size up the costs and benefits. This is how I see the values, the transcendental values or whatever. I'm not satisfied with saying it's purely subjective, because in the sense, well, no, it is purely subjective. But the point is, it's not that there's no category to put them in. There is a common category. And the way I know there's a common category is because everybody in this sample, with completely different religious scriptures, different pastors, preachers, rabbis, priests, discuss the way they negotiate the size of their family in almost identical language. Like I expected to find commonalities across religions. I did not expect it to be as profound as it was. Like I was personally quite surprised, just quite surprised. So yeah, if you have further thoughts or you wake up next week with a new phrase for me, please send it to me. This is a real question. Yes, over here.
Well, I was going to ask you. Some years ago, I remember studies in India that where there was a struggle with trying to bring down total fertility rates. One of the most powerful factors in that was education of girls. If you gave them, an economic opportunity or an alternative, does that still hold true? And the other question was individual preference. Women who just love being mothers. Yeah. It is not really, if they have the economic wherewithal to do it, and sometimes they don't.
I mean, like the woman I told you about who, was finished residency, had her first kid, and said, she said something like, they were, I think what religion they were kind of, they were kind of evangelical. She said something like, I don't know when we tipped over from being people who had like a couple kids to being people who had just had like a lot of kids. She said, we just kept liking the kids. It was a really funny phrase that she had. We just kept liking it. So there's some kind of personal preference there. She hated being a doctor when she had her first kid. She sort of said, gosh, this is like way better than I thought. That wasn't universal across our sample. We did have people who said, I still don't love this more than anything else that I'm doing, but I think it has more value than anything else. Right? So there were 2 different kinds of things there. Your first question about education, yes, it still operates. It's very strong. A huge part of that is, of course, you mentioned, we talked about just the more education you have, the higher the opportunity cost of not working. But the other piece about education, I mean, when you talked about like India or places that really were struggling with what they thought to be high birth rates, the other piece of that is if you put people in school longer, they're just not going to have as many years to have children. Yeah. So I mean, there's this issue. You raise the age of marriage and you raise the number of years people are in school, and then just because actually women's fertility drops, just biologically drops pretty significantly between the ages of 15 and 25. Like everybody who gets married in our society in that, mid to late 20s is already they've already missed the most fertile years, and nobody really knows this. They kind of think that they're really super fertile in their 20s. And that's because when you're, 38 trying to have your first child, you're like pining for your 25s, but the 25s are a lot less fertile than the 15s. So if you put people in school from when they're 15 to 20, which is kind of the big move in most of the global development, you want to push people from not finishing high school to finishing high school, maybe doing some postgraduate work, that's just gonna mechanically reduce fertility rate. It's just mechanical, it doesn't even operate. We haven't even talked about preferences yet, so yeah, it still works. It's a very good way to reduce fertility. Yeah.
I don't know if this could be a way to reach your research and Mark's research, but they also need to be a little critical somehow. Like we also say that like having all the women in education and having CHIPS Act being it's very unlikely that men would be willing to say, oh yeah, sure, I'll never like for you and for the 3, 6, 8 kids, because there is a market where I'm not required to do it anymore. You can take care of yourself. You want to take care of yourself, and looking at everything else. So there is a change, but then it's just like it's a series of changes that affects every choice.
Yeah.
It's not just like getting more education, which just I think changes the whole picture. I think that what is if you agree that the most fascinating part of the research to me is that if a society that doesn't have a deeper meaning is a society that dies. Like that to me is the takeaway, because all these people you're talking about, they have a deeper meaning. Like they're not just here for themselves.
Yeah, I think you could make that argument for sure. To your first point about connecting it with Mark's research, what I want to say is, at the moment, I kind of feel like my job here is I'm in the business of trying to take things that people can't see and just bring them to light. And I think a lot of people will draw different conclusions from this. But one of the really big things that has been very interesting to me is that most Western fertility research has neglected to ask men what they would like to have. Men are never asked. So while we all kind of chuckle, like there's this guy who thinks he's got great genes. He has a gym in his basement of his house, like with weights and stuff. I'm telling you, there's a lot of stuff I can't tell you about this guy because it'll just become clear who he is. But he thinks he's got great genes. He wants to have lots of offspring. It's awesome. But we all chuckle at that because we kind of have a sense that that's uncommon today. But we don't really know how uncommon it is. We actually don't know very much. And it turns out that Western fertility surveys, and I did a pretty comprehensive picking through of them, like all the big ones, like the NSFGs and the ones in Europe, all the Western ones, Europe, the United States, they didn't think it was important to ask. So we know things about the evolution of women's fertility expectations, their desires for children. Nobody thought it was that interesting to ask men what they would like to have or like to. And to me, that's like a stunning omission. Like it's stunning. Okay, so if you talk to people doing sort of like on the ground research in demography in developing countries, parts of Africa, and you ask them, do people's family sizes reflect primarily women's desires for children and trade-offs they make between their career, or do they reflect? And then we'll tell you immediately, oh heck, like this is a bargaining situation. The guys have some interest, the girls have some interest, and there's like a thing that happens, and it's not always so obvious who's in control, so to speak, or who's like, right, this is a bargain. I mean, so now like those of you that might be social scientists here or economists, you think about like all the ways we think about what happens with bargaining outcomes. Like who's got the upper hand, what institutions might tip the scales. Okay, so actually all of Western fertility research has no answer to the question of whether the fertility gap, which we observe, is in part a reflection of the bargaining between men and women over fertility desires. We don't know the answer, it's just an enormous black box. So I don't think, like, I'm not, so there's some suggestive things. We do know a couple of things. We do know that kind of like women and men have a different experience of having children, but beyond that, there's like a big giant, so I mean, one of the things I want to know is like, well, why aren't we asking the guys? And then why aren't we then looking at this question, right? So like they've all just assumed that the outcome of people's family sizes is like a female choice. But these are also people who generally assume that like there's all these structural pressures that oppress women. Like, well, isn't maybe possibly marriage one of them? I mean, I thought marriage was potentially an oppressive institution in which women didn't get what they wanted all the time. And I'm not prepared to say it's not in some ways an oppressive institution. It's certainly a restrictive institution. Okay, so why don't we ask? We don't ask. It's amazing. So I'm hoping that's one of the things that comes out of this, is we start to like, let's find out what guys are interested in. What do they want when they're 18? What do they want when they're 20? What do they want? But we know, we have this, like we can track this for women for 40 years and get nothing from the guys. Shocking. It's amazing. Sorry, was there another hand? Is that? Oh, no.
So what is the next study? To look at guys, you know, in a small group, or do a broader study of women to find out more about it statistically? And then the also the question, you kind of seem sort of have this implies a preconceived notion that we want to encourage higher birth rates. Do we really want that as a country? Are we trying to push the birth rate up? I don't know.
Well, for sure, this is like a huge part of the current policy conversation. Like for the last couple of, I mean, I'm not saying it ought to be, but I'm saying that's what we're hearing. I mean, there's a significant number of lawmakers that are interested in proposing these bigger, but I don't know that we want to push birth rates up as much as we want to like not be in a deficit, and nobody thinks we know how to operate in a deficit. I mean, below replacement level fertility. But to your first question, this took me so much longer than I expected that I have no future plans except to say that I just want to finish this. I just want to finish this. So this is, you know, I'm currently writing this up. It's a manuscript, and hopefully, God willing, in the next year it'll be done and you can take it home with you. But no, I have lots of other future things planned. And actually, there's at least 25 questions that you could just ask existing data that have already come out of these interviews, which I would need a center and 25 researchers to kind of get that done. And I don't have that at the moment. So if anybody's looking for a dissertation topic, I've got a lot of interesting questions for you to research. So yeah, this is a tip of the iceberg sort of situation, but I'm not ready to say what's next.
Maybe done.
Thank you.